It was supposed to be a routine Tuesday. As the owner of 8 rental properties spread across 3 neighborhoods in our suburban community, my days often involved checking on tenants, making repairs, and ensuring everything ran smoothly. The property on Oakwood Drive had been particularly profitable, a 3-bedroom ranch-style home with good tenants who always paid on time. I had stopped by to inspect a recently repaired fence in the backyard, nothing unusual. The late April sunshine warmed my back as I walked the property line, examining the new cedar panels. That is when I noticed something odd in the mulch bed alongside the house. A thick black cable, partially buried under decorative river rocks, stretched from my electrical junction box toward the neighboring property. Someone had carefully arranged artificial plants around it in an obvious attempt at concealment. I knelt down to take a closer look. The cable disappeared beneath the fence into my neighbor's yard. This was not a standard electrical connection. This appeared to be a deliberate splice into my power line, amateur work that created not only a theft issue but also a serious fire hazard. I pulled out my phone and took several photos from different angles, documenting what I had discovered. My mind raced with questions. How long had this been happening? My tenants had complained about unusually high electric bills over the past few months. I had assumed it was due to the harsh winter and had even arranged for an energy efficiency inspection. Now the truth became clear. Someone had been stealing electricity directly from my property. Using my property management app, I pulled up the utility records for the past 6 months. The evidence was undeniable. Electric usage had jumped nearly 40% compared to the previous year. This explained the additional $300 per month my tenants had been paying, money that was essentially flowing straight into powering the neighbor's home. I called my regular electrician, sending him photos of what I had found. He confirmed my suspicions. "That is definitely an illegal tap into your line," he said. "Pretty dangerous work, too. Whoever did this could have electrocuted themselves or started a fire." As I continued documenting the situation, I noticed movement across the fence. A woman in her 50s with perfectly highlighted blonde hair watched me intently from her kitchen window. When she realized I had spotted her, she quickly disappeared from view. Moments later, she emerged from her front door and walked with deliberate casualness toward me. "Having some work done on the property?" she asked with practiced pleasantness, her eyes scanning my phone and the exposed cable I had been photographing. "Just routine maintenance," I replied, curious about her sudden interest. "Do you know anything about this cable connection?" "Oh, those old utility lines. They have been there forever," she said dismissively, though I noticed her smile tighten slightly. "I am Nancy Winters, by the way, HOA Board Treasurer for Oakwood Estates." She emphasized her title with obvious pride, extending a manicured hand which I shook briefly. Before I could ask further questions, she launched into a rehearsed speech about neighborhood standards and property values. Her eyes kept darting toward the exposed cable, betraying her apparent concern. After she left, I made a decision. Rather than immediately calling the police, I would approach this strategically. First, I would document everything thoroughly. Then I would confront her directly about the theft. If that failed to resolve the situation, then authorities would need to be involved. Little did I know this simple discovery would spiral into a neighborhood power struggle that would test my patience, resources, and resolve in ways I never imagined. Before confronting my neighbor, I spent that evening researching utility theft laws in our state. What I discovered was concerning. Electricity theft was not just a civil matter. It constituted a criminal offense with potential felony charges depending on the amount stolen and duration. The estimated $300 per month over 6 months put this firmly in serious territory. I printed out relevant sections of the utility code along with documentation of the unusual power consumption. The next morning, I returned to the property with my folder of evidence. I had rehearsed a rational, non-accusatory approach. My goal was resolution, not escalation. Nancy Winters was tending to her immaculate front garden when I approached. Her designer sunglasses sat perched atop her head, and a clipboard rested on a nearby decorative bench. The picture of suburban authority. "Good morning, Nancy," I said pleasantly. "I was hoping we could discuss something important regarding our properties." "Of course," she replied with a practiced smile that did not quite reach her eyes. "Always happy to discuss neighborhood matters." I gestured toward her porch. "Do you mind if we sit down? This is somewhat serious." Her eyebrows raised slightly, but she nodded and led me to her pristine white porch furniture. The cushions looked as though no one had ever sat on them. "I noticed something concerning yesterday," I began, keeping my tone neutral. "There appears to be an electrical line running from my junction box directly into your property. My electrician confirmed it is an unauthorized connection." The transformation was immediate and chilling. The pleasant neighbor facade dropped away like a mask. Her back stiffened, and her expression hardened. "That is a ridiculous accusation," she said, her voice sharp. "That line has been there since before you owned the property." I opened my folder and placed the dated photos on the table between us. "These were taken yesterday. The connection is new and unauthorized. It explains why my tenants have been experiencing unusually high electric bills." Nancy glanced at the photos, then pushed them back toward me with one finger as if they were contaminated. "I have an arrangement with the previous owner. He allowed me access to that line for my garden lighting." "I have owned this property for 4 years," I replied calmly. "There was no such arrangement mentioned in any documentation, and more importantly, this connection was recently installed. The previous owner has been gone for years." Her eyes narrowed as she realized her lie had been caught. She stood abruptly, crossing her arms. "Do you have any idea who you are dealing with? I am not just your neighbor. I run this neighborhood." "This is not a neighborhood issue, Nancy. This is utility theft." "Let me explain something to you," she interrupted, voice dropping to a threatening whisper. "As HOA treasurer, I notice your rental property has several potential violations that have been overlooked until now. The fence height appears to exceed regulations by 2 inches. Your tenants often park their third vehicle on the street overnight, which violates Section 8.3 of our covenant. The satellite dish installation lacks proper approval forms." I remained seated, maintaining calm despite her growing hostility. "Are you threatening me with HOA violations because I discovered you stealing electricity?" "I am simply pointing out that selective enforcement works both ways," she replied with cold calculation. "Remove that line, and suddenly your property might face thousands in fines and legal fees. Is that really worth it over a misunderstanding about a power connection?" I stood now, meeting her gaze directly. "This is not a misunderstanding. This is theft. I have documented everything, including this conversation. I am giving you 24 hours notice that tomorrow morning my electrician will be removing the illegal connection and repairing the damage to my junction box. If you interfere or retaliate, the documentation goes directly to the police and the county prosecutor." Her face flushed with anger. "You have no idea the connections I have in this community. The police chief plays golf with my husband. The mayor attended my Christmas party." "That may be true," I replied evenly. "But the law is still the law. The line will be removed tomorrow at 9 a.m. I suggest you make alternative arrangements for your power needs." As I walked away, I could feel her glare burning into my back. I heard her voice call after me, "You are making a serious mistake. No one crosses me in Oakwood Estates." Despite maintaining a calm exterior, internally my heart raced. I had just directly challenged someone who clearly wielded her authority like a weapon. But principles mattered. You cannot allow someone to steal from you simply because confrontation is uncomfortable. Little did I know how quickly and severely she would escalate this situation. The following morning dawned clear and warm. I arrived at the property at 8:30 with Dave, my regular electrician. He brought specialized equipment to safely disconnect the illegal line and repair the damaged junction box. As an additional precaution, I had arranged for a security company to install 2 cameras with clear views of the electrical panel and the property line. "This is some of the most amateur electrical work I have ever seen," Dave muttered as he examined the connection more closely. "Whoever did this risked electrocution. No proper insulation, no conduit protection. It is a serious fire hazard." The security technician worked quickly, mounting weatherproof cameras while Dave prepared to disconnect the illegal line. I stood nearby, documenting the process with photos and video on my phone as additional evidence. "Residential electrical lines carry 240 volts, Dave explained as he put on heavy insulated gloves. "Enough to kill someone instantly if they make a mistake. Whoever did this was either very lucky or had some basic knowledge, but it is still incredibly dangerous and completely illegal." At precisely 9 a.m., Dave carefully cut the unauthorized line and properly capped the connection point. He then began repairing the damage to my junction box, installing a new weatherproof access panel with a keyed lock. The reaction was almost immediate. Less than 3 minutes after the line was cut, Nancy's back door flew open with such force it banged against the exterior wall of her house. She stormed across her yard toward the fence separating our properties, her face contorted with rage. "What do you think you are doing?" she shouted, her voice echoing across the morning quiet of the neighborhood. "Stop that immediately." I stepped forward, keeping my voice calm and level. "Good morning, Nancy. As I mentioned yesterday, we are removing the unauthorized electrical connection from my property. That is my power line. You have no right to cut it." She gripped the top of the fence, knuckles white with tension. Dave continued working, deliberately focusing on the repair rather than the confrontation. The security technician paused momentarily, then resumed mounting the second camera. "Actually, it is my power line, connected illegally to my electrical system," I corrected her. "The disconnection is now complete. I suggest you contact the power company if you are experiencing electrical issues." Nancy unlatched the gate between our properties and stormed into the yard, marching directly toward Dave and the exposed electrical panel. Her sudden intrusion caused Dave to stand quickly, positioning himself protectively between her and the open electrical box. "Ma'am, please stay back," he warned firmly. "This is an active electrical area. For your safety, you need to maintain distance." "This is illegal. You cannot just disconnect my power," she shouted, attempting to move past him toward the junction box. "Nancy, you are trespassing on my property," I stated clearly. "Please return to your yard immediately. This work is being done legally on my property to remove an unauthorized connection. If you continue to interfere, we will need to contact the authorities." At the mention of authorities, she hesitated. By now, several neighbors had emerged from their homes, watching the scene unfold with undisguised curiosity. Nancy glanced around, suddenly aware of the audience. Her performance now had witnesses. "You have made a serious mistake," she hissed, backing away slightly but maintaining her posture of indignation. "I will have the HOA legal team review this immediately. Expect official violation notices by this afternoon." As she turned to leave, she noticed the security camera being installed and pointed directly at it. "And those cameras better not be recording any portion of my property, or you will be in violation of privacy ordinances." The security technician, a former police officer himself, spoke up. "Ma'am, these cameras are positioned legally within property boundaries and focused on this property only, as allowed by state law." Nancy stormed back to her yard, phone already pressed to her ear as she began what appeared to be an animated conversation. The neighbors remained, whispering among themselves as Dave completed the repair work and secured the new locked panel over the junction box. "You have stirred up a hornet nest," Dave commented quietly as he packed his tools. "People like that do not like being caught or challenged." I nodded, watching as Nancy paced her back porch, gesturing emphatically into her phone. "Sometimes you have to stand your ground, regardless of the consequences." Little did I know just how severe those consequences would soon become. The retaliation began precisely 3 hours after the power line was disconnected. I had just finished reviewing the security camera installation when my phone rang with a call from my tenant. 2 police cruisers had just pulled into the driveway with lights flashing. I arrived back at the property 15 minutes later to find a calculated scene of neighborhood theater in progress. Nancy stood near her property line with arms crossed, watching with obvious satisfaction as 2 uniformed officers examined the electrical junction box. Several neighbors had gathered on the sidewalk, drawn by the spectacle of police lights in their quiet community. As I parked and approached, Nancy began narrating loudly enough for everyone to hear. "That is him, officers. He vandalized my property this morning and cut the power line to my home. I want to press charges for criminal damage." The officers turned toward me. The younger one had a notepad out, while the older officer, gray at the temples with the weathered face of a veteran, studied me with careful neutrality. "Sir, we received a complaint about vandalism at this address," the older officer stated professionally. "Can you explain what happened here today?" Before responding, I noticed Nancy's smug expression. She clearly expected the authority she had summoned to automatically take her side. She did not know I had come prepared. "Officers, I am the owner of this property," I explained calmly, producing my identification and property deed from my folder. What was removed today was an illegal electrical connection that had been installed without permission to siphon power from my junction box to the neighboring property. I presented the dated photographs showing the unauthorized line, along with utility bills documenting the suspicious increase in power usage. The younger officer reviewed the materials while his partner listened to my explanation. The electrical line in question was installed without my knowledge or consent, constituting utility theft. I provided 24 hours notice before having a licensed electrician safely remove the connection and repair the damage to my property. The older officer examined the documentation carefully, his expression revealing nothing. But when I mentioned the property address, something changed in his demeanor. A subtle shift in his posture, a momentary narrowing of his eyes. He glanced at the address again, then back at me with what seemed like dawning recognition. Nancy sensed the change in momentum and approached quickly. "That line has been there for years. It was an approved connection between properties from the previous owner. He destroyed it without proper notification or HOA approval." Do you have documentation of this approval? The older officer asked her directly. Nancy hesitated. Those records would be in the HOA archives. I can have them pulled. We would be interested in seeing those, he replied evenly. In the meantime, this appears to be a civil matter between property owners. There is no evidence of criminal vandalism if the owner was removing an unauthorized connection from his own property. Nancy's expression hardened. So you are just going to let him get away with this? Do you have any idea who I am in this community? The younger officer cleared his throat. Ma'am, we can take statements from both parties, but as my partner said, this appears to be a civil dispute. You may want to consult with an attorney regarding any claims of property damage. The confrontation deflated visibly. The officers took our contact information and statements. Throughout the process, I noticed the older officer glancing at me with an unreadable expression. As they prepared to leave, he handed me his card. If you have any further issues, please contact me directly, he said quietly. The police departed without making any arrests, leaving Nancy standing at her property line, phone already in hand. The gathered neighbors slowly dispersed, many giving me curious glances as they returned to their homes. That evening, as predicted, the retaliation escalated. My email inbox chimed repeatedly with notifications from the Oakwood Estates HOA. 6 separate violation notices, each citing increasingly obscure sections of the community covenant: improper fence height, unauthorized satellite dish installation, landscape maintenance deficiencies, improper storage of trash receptacles. Each violation carried proposed fines ranging from $200 to $500. I reviewed each citation carefully, noting that all had been issued personally by Nancy Winters in her capacity as HOA treasurer. The timing made the motivation transparent. This was punishment for challenging her authority and exposing her theft. The following morning brought further escalation. My tenant called in distress. An HOA inspection team was photographing the property and placing violation notices on the front door. When my tenant attempted to ask questions, they were rudely dismissed and told to take it up with the property owner. A pattern was emerging. This was not just about electricity anymore. Nancy was using her position of authority to wage a systematic campaign against my property. The financial impact of fighting multiple HOA citations could potentially cost thousands in legal fees and fines, far more than the stolen electricity had cost. It was a calculated escalation, designed to make me back down through sheer administrative harassment. That afternoon, I received an unexpected call from my property management company. Someone wanted to speak with me urgently regarding the situation at Oakwood Drive. The caller refused to leave details, but insisted it was important. I agreed to a meeting the following morning at a local coffee shop, unaware that this conversation would dramatically change the power dynamic in the ongoing conflict. The coffee shop buzzed with morning activity as I claimed a quiet corner table. I arrived early, unsure who had requested this mysterious meeting. 15 minutes later, the door opened, and I immediately recognized the older police officer from yesterday's confrontation. He had exchanged his uniform for jeans and a casual button-down shirt, but his alert, observant demeanor remained unchanged. He spotted me and approached with purposeful strides. "Thank you for meeting me," he said, extending his hand. "Michael Thornton, we met under less pleasant circumstances yesterday." "Yes, of course," I replied, somewhat confused by this unexpected development. "What can I help you with, Officer Thornton?" "Mike is fine when I am off duty," he said, settling into the chair across from me. "And I believe we might be able to help each other. There is something you should know. I am actually one of your tenants." The revelation caught me completely off guard. One of my tenants. He nodded. The duplex on Westridge Lane. I have been renting the East Unit for about 2 years now. When you mentioned the property address yesterday during our call, I recognized your name from my lease agreement. It is quite a coincidence. I processed this information slowly. That is unexpected, but I am not sure I understand why you wanted to meet. Mike leaned forward, lowering his voice slightly. Because Nancy Winters is not just causing problems for you. She has been weaponizing the HOA against residents throughout Oakwood Estates for years. What happened with the power line? That is just the tip of the iceberg. He pulled a thin folder from his messenger bag and slid it across the table. Inside were printed police reports, 6 separate calls to the same neighborhood over the past 18 months. Each involved disputes between Nancy and different homeowners, complaints about harassment, property disputes, and intimidation tactics. None of these resulted in charges, Mike explained. But the pattern is clear. She uses her HOA position to pressure and intimidate anyone who crosses her. We cannot take official action because, technically, she operates within the letter of the law if not the spirit. But it is a clear abuse of power. I reviewed the reports carefully. Why are you sharing this with me? Because she finally made a mistake with you. Utility theft is a criminal offense, not just an HOA matter. And I suspect there might be more going on with HOA finances than meets the eye. Mike explained that during his 2 years renting in the area, he had heard numerous stories from neighbors and fellow officers about Nancy's iron-fisted control over the community. Selective enforcement of rules, special exemptions for friends, and suspicious contracting decisions that always seemed to benefit companies connected to board members. Last year, an elderly resident, Mrs. Jenkins on Sycamore Court, installed a wheelchair ramp after her hip surgery. Nancy cited her for an unauthorized exterior modification and demanded its removal, despite medical necessity exemptions clearly stated in the Americans with Disabilities Act. When Mrs. Jenkins challenged this, she suddenly received citations for 5 other alleged violations. The pattern was disturbingly similar to what I was experiencing. Mike continued, revealing that 2 other neighbors had their property improvements mysteriously rejected by the Architectural Review Committee, only to receive approvals after hearing a specific contractor who happened to be Nancy's brother-in-law. I believe she is abusing her position for personal gain, Mike concluded. But proving it has been difficult because most residents eventually give in rather than fight. They cannot afford the legal battle. And you think my situation with the electrical theft provides an opportunity? He nodded. It is concrete evidence of improper behavior, not just administrative overreach. And if we look deeper into HOA finances during her tenure, we might find more. As our conversation continued, Mike revealed he had begun quietly collecting statements from affected residents. Several were willing to speak about their experiences but feared retaliation. His position as both law enforcement and a community member gave him unique insight and access. There is an HOA board meeting scheduled for next month. Elections will be held for 2 positions, including treasurer. With proper documentation and enough resident support, there might be a path to removing her from power legally. I considered his proposition carefully. This had evolved beyond a simple property dispute into something with community-wide implications. If Nancy had been abusing her authority systematically, allowing it to continue would harm many others beyond myself. What exactly are you proposing? I asked. A partnership of sorts. You have concrete evidence of misconduct. I have access to community members and knowledge of similar patterns. Together, we might be able to build a case strong enough to present to the full HOA membership. By the time we finished our coffee, the outlines of a plan had taken shape. I would provide documentation of the utility theft and resulting HOA retaliation. Mike would continue gathering statements from other affected residents. Together, we would request financial audits of HOA records, looking for irregularities that might reveal further misuse of power. As we parted ways, Mike offered a final thought. People like Nancy count on others backing down. They win by intimidation. But when someone finally stands their ground with evidence and community support, that is when things change. I left the coffee shop with renewed determination. This was no longer just about defending my property from unfair citations. It had become about protecting an entire community from systematic abuse of power. The confrontation had just taken an unexpected turn. The next 2 weeks unfolded like a carefully orchestrated investigation. My dining room table transformed into command central, covered with documents, financial statements, and resident testimonials. Mike, who I now thought of as Steve, his preferred name off-duty, brought reports from his unofficial community interviews. Each day added new pieces to our growing puzzle of HOA misconduct. The first breakthrough came from Mrs. Jenkins, the elderly resident who had been harassed over her medical ramp. Despite her initial reluctance, she agreed to meet at her home to share her experience. "I have lived in this neighborhood for 22 years, she explained, her hands trembling slightly as she showed us the violation notices she had received. "After my surgery, the doctor said I needed the ramp for at least 6 months. The HOA guidelines clearly allow temporary medical modifications, but Nancy said my ramp was 2 inches too wide and demanded I remove it immediately." Mrs. Jenkins described how the harassment escalated when she questioned the decision. "Suddenly, my flower pots were violations. My mailbox was the wrong shade of black. My bird feeder attracted nuisance wildlife. 6 citations in 2 weeks, each with a $200 fine. I live on Social Security. I could not afford to fight." Her story matched the pattern emerging from other testimonials. Challenge Nancy's authority. Face immediate and disproportionate retaliation. A young couple from the corner house shared emails demanding they remove their toddler's swing set due to non-approved recreational equipment visible from the street. An immigrant family received repeated citations for cultural decorations during Diwali celebrations, despite the fact that Christmas decorations remained unregulated. But the most concerning discovery came when we obtained copies of the HOA financial statements for the past 3 years. As treasurer, Nancy had complete control over association accounts with minimal oversight. The documents revealed troubling patterns that might explain her desperation to maintain power. "Look at these maintenance expenses," Steve pointed out, highlighting a series of payments. $12,000 for landscape irrigation repair last summer, but there was no significant work done on the common areas. And the vendor is registered to an LLC with the same address as Nancy's sister. Similar discrepancies appeared throughout the financial records. Inflated invoices for services never fully rendered. Consulting fees to vaguely named companies that traced back to friends or relatives. Administrative expenses without receipts or documentation. Conservative estimates suggested nearly $40,000 of questionable spending over 3 years. Not massive embezzlement, but significant misappropriation of community funds. "This explains why she fights so hard to maintain control," I observed. "If she loses her position, a proper audit would expose everything." The electricity theft from my property suddenly made more sense too. Nancy had been skimming from HOA funds while simultaneously reducing her personal expenses through utility theft. It was a pattern of entitlement and exploitation that extended from the organization to individual residents. As our investigation deepened, more residents cautiously came forward. A former architectural committee member revealed how applications were routinely rejected unless applicants used approved contractors who paid kickbacks to board members. A previous board secretary shared how meeting minutes were selectively edited to remove resident complaints or questions about financial decisions. One particularly valuable discovery came when Steve located records showing Nancy had previously served on another HOA board across town, until being removed following similar allegations of financial irregularities. She had simply moved neighborhoods and established a new power base at Oakwood Estates, where residents were unaware of her history. The pattern is undeniable, Steve concluded as we organized our findings. Systematic abuse of authority, financial mismanagement, selective enforcement, and personal enrichment through position. Classic corruption, just on a neighborhood scale. With the annual HOA meeting approaching, we carefully prepared our presentation. The evidence was compiled into clear, irrefutable documentation: photos of the illegal electrical connection, annotated financial statements highlighting discrepancies, resident testimonials, and copies of the retaliatory citations issued immediately after challenging her authority. Thunder rumbled outside as we finalized our strategy. The investigation had grown beyond anything I had initially imagined when discovering that strange power cable. What began as defending my property rights had evolved into exposing a system of neighborhood corruption that affected dozens of families. "Are you ready for the backlash?" Steve asked as we organized the presentation materials. "Nancy will not go down without a fight. She has built her identity around this power." I considered his question carefully. Sometimes you have to stand up to bullies, regardless of the cost, not just for yourself, but for everyone they have intimidated into silence. The upcoming HOA meeting would no longer be a routine gathering to discuss lawn height requirements and parking regulations. It would become the setting for a long-overdue community reckoning. The question remained whether enough residents would find the courage to stand with us when confronted with the evidence. After years of intimidation, fear had become deeply ingrained in the neighborhood culture. But as we reviewed our documentation one final time, I felt cautiously optimistic. The truth, when properly presented, has power that even the most determined intimidation cannot always overcome. The community center hummed with unusual energy as residents filed in for the quarterly HOA meeting. Normally, these gatherings attracted only the most dedicated participants, rarely more than 15 or 20 homeowners. Tonight, nearly 80 people filled the rows of folding chairs, creating a buzz of anticipation. Word had spread through unofficial channels that something significant would happen. Nancy arrived precisely on time, her composure revealing nothing unusual despite the unprecedented attendance. She took her place at the center of the board table, arranging her materials with practiced precision. Her eyes narrowed slightly at the crowd, but she maintained her professional demeanor, unaware that her carefully constructed position of authority stood on the precipice of collapse. "Welcome to the quarterly meeting of Oakwood Estates Homeowners Association," she began, her voice carrying the artificial warmth of someone accustomed to controlling a room. "We have a full agenda tonight, beginning with the treasurer's report and moving to violations review." The meeting proceeded with rehearsed efficiency through budget updates and committee reports. Nancy skillfully deflected the few questions raised about maintenance expenses with technical jargon that confused rather than clarified. As the meeting moved toward its scheduled conclusion, she appeared increasingly confident, perhaps believing she had successfully navigated another gathering without serious challenge. "Our final agenda item is new business," she announced, clearly expecting none. "Does anyone have matters to bring before the board?" The moment had arrived. I stood, folder in hand, and moved toward the front of the room. "Yes, I have several important issues to present to the full membership." Nancy's expression flickered briefly before she composed herself. "Please state your name and property address for the record." I introduced myself clearly, establishing my position as a property owner within the community. "I have documentation regarding several serious concerns that affect all members of this association." As I began distributing copies of our findings to each board member and the front row of residents, Nancy attempted to regain control. "Any concerns should be submitted in writing to the board for review before public discussion." "According to the bylaws, Section 4.3, I countered calmly, "any member may present issues of community concern during new business with no prior notification required. I believe utility theft, financial mismanagement, and abuse of authority qualify as community concerns." A murmur spread through the room as residents realized this would not be a typical meeting. Nancy gripped her gavel tightly, knuckles whitening with pressure. I presented our evidence methodically, beginning with the documented electrical theft from my property, including photographs, electrical inspector reports, and utility records showing the suspicious usage patterns. As gasps and whispers filled the room, I moved to the pattern of retaliatory citations issued immediately after the disconnection. Steve rose next, introducing himself as both a resident and law enforcement officer. His dual identity created immediate credibility as he outlined the pattern of selective enforcement and intimidation that had characterized Nancy's leadership. Multiple residents have provided statements describing how questioning board decisions resulted in immediate, punitive citation campaigns against their properties, he explained, his professional demeanor leaving no room for dismissal. Nancy interrupted repeatedly, attempting to label our presentation as personal grievances and procedural violations. But the evidence continued to mount as we presented the financial discrepancies, projected clearly on the wall for all to see. Questionable contractors, inflated invoices, services paid for but never completed. The pattern was undeniable. Mrs. Jenkins spoke next, her voice gaining strength as she described the harassment over her medical ramp. Other residents, emboldened by her courage, stood to share similar experiences. What had begun as one property owner's complaint transformed into a community-wide reckoning. Nancy's attempts to control the meeting grew increasingly desperate. "This is slander. These allegations are completely unfounded. I have served this community faithfully for years." The turning point came when we revealed documentation of her previous removal from another HOA board for similar issues, information that had been deliberately concealed from Oakwood Estates residents during her campaign for treasurer. The bylaws clearly state that board members must disclose any previous HOA leadership positions and the circumstances of their conclusion, Steve pointed out. This omission alone violates the qualification requirements for board service. A call came from the back of the room. I moved for an immediate vote of no confidence and removal from position. The motion was quickly seconded by multiple voices. Nancy stood, face flushed with anger. "You cannot do this. This meeting is adjourned." But it was too late. The community had found its voice. The vote required little discussion, hands raised overwhelmingly in support of removal. Nancy collected her materials with shaking hands and left without further comment, the power she had wielded so forcefully now completely stripped away. In the weeks that followed, professional auditors were brought in to review the HOA finances properly. The full extent of the mismanagement was documented, with recommendations for recovery and new financial controls. A temporary board was established until proper elections could be held, with transparent processes and term limits included in revised bylaws. Most importantly, the culture of the neighborhood began to heal. Residents who had avoided each other for fear of being reported for violations began to interact more freely. Garden improvements appeared without the paralysis of excessive approval processes. Children played more visibly in front yards previously kept antiseptically perfect to avoid scrutiny. 3 months later, I received a letter from the new HOA board. They had voted unanimously to name the newly renovated community garden after Mrs. Jenkins, a small but meaningful acknowledgement of her courage in speaking up despite her vulnerability. As for the power connection that started everything, it had been properly disconnected and secured. But the true power restored to Oakwood Estates went far beyond electricity. It was the power of community, of fairness, of neighbors looking out for each other.